Welcome to the 2020 presentation of the John Bartlow Martin Award. The Bartlow Martin Award is one of Medill's highest honors. It's our way of recognizing compelling journalism that raises awareness of issues that are or should be of tremendous public concern. The award is named for a distinguished journalist and longtime Medill faculty member who I happen to have had as my own magazine writing instructor when I was an undergraduate here, way back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. What John Bartlow Martin impressed upon me and all of his charges was the importance of doing journalism that illuminates the human condition, particularly the pain and suffering of the disenfranchised and dispossessed. He encouraged us not to merely write about politics and policies, but to write about the effects that those policies had on people whose voices were rarely heard in the national discourse. I suppose that today we might refer to John Bartlow Martin as a social justice warrior, though I'm sure he would reject that nomenclature and prefer instead to be called a journalist who tried to do work that made a difference. We're pleased to present this year's John Bartlow Martin Award to Lizzie Presser of ProPublica for her trenchant investigation of the revocation of property rights of African-American individuals and families in North Carolina. Congratulations, Lizzie. Your work is clearly in the spirit of John Bartlow Martin. I'm sure he would approve. Before I turn this evening's proceedings over to my colleague, Professor Patty Walter, who directs the judging of this award, allow us to tell you a little bit more about the man for whom this honor is named.
John Bartlow Martin was a master storyteller. His coverage of people suffering from poverty, racism, and mental illness drew national attention to problems in American society. His work was published in major magazines such as Harper's, the Saturday Evening Post, Life, Look, and Esquire. His powerful stories prompted policy changes and inspired other journalists to make a difference with their own reporting. Martin's career was varied. He wrote speeches for candidates like Robert Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, and Adlai Stevenson. He worked with then FCC Commissioner Newton Minow on the famous Vast Wasteland speech. He also worked on the presidential campaign of John F. Kennedy, who appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the Dominican Republic in 1962. He witnessed the first democratic elections there after decades of dictatorship. Martin was born in 1915 in Hamilton, Ohio, but moved to Indianapolis with his parents 4 years later. In his autobiography, he described his childhood as unhappy and marked by poverty brought on by the Great Depression. Those experiences developed his sympathy for society's downtrodden. He earned his degree from DePauw University in 1935 while working for the Indianapolis Times newspaper. He moved to Chicago with the proceeds from his first freelance article and launched his career in earnest. Martin established himself in the journalism world with a 1948 Harper's article about a mine explosion in Centralia, Illinois, which killed 100 people. The article was more than 18,000 words long, the longest Harper's had ever published. It helped lead to changes in federal mine safety rules. Martin was the author of 15 books, including a 2-volume biography of Adlai Stevenson, A History of Indiana, and a book about American policy in the Caribbean. Martin taught for 10 years at Medill, teaching and inspiring students. He died in 1987, and Medill established the John Bartlow Martin Award the following year to honor his work and his passion for the power of journalism to improve society.
And now, join me in welcoming Professor Patty Walter.
Hello, everybody. Welcome tonight. I'd like to start by introducing our award winner today, Lizzie Presser. Lizzie joins us remotely from New York, where she is a reporter for ProPublica, specializing in health, inequality, and policy. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, which partnered with ProPublica for this award-winning story, as well as Harper's Magazine, which I love the symmetry with John Bartlow Martin. But of course, her work has also appeared in the publications that weren't around then, but now are some of the vanguards of where we see this kind of reporting: The Guardian, This American Life, California Sunday magazine. Along the way, she's garnered multiple national magazine finalist designations, the Livingston Award, and the George Polk Award. She received her BA from Princeton and a master's in public policy from Cambridge University. We get to honor Lizzie today as our 2020 John Bartlow Martin Award winner for the story The Dispossessed. But along with the congratulations from Medill, I'd also like to extend a heartfelt congratulations from the Martin family, some of whom are here on this Zoom and would love to be shaking your hand in person were that possible. I'd like to extend another thank you to the Martin family just for making this award possible and making sure that social justice journalism like The Dispossessed gets widespread and continued recognition. With that, Lizzie, let's get on to the Q&A and conversation we want to hear. And to the audience, I just want to remind you that this is a webinar on Zoom, which means you put any questions you have in the Q&A tab on your Zoom bar instead of the chat tab. And we will be turning it over to the audience at some point. So please start putting questions in there as they come up all along the way. I promise we'll get to you. Okay, Lizzie, welcome. And I'm going to throw you a quick softball just for those who may not have had time to read the whole story. If you could give us just a quick summary of what The Dispossessed is about.
I'd be happy to, but first I just want to say thank you to you and thank you to Dean Whitaker and to the Medill School, to the Martin family for this enormous honor, and particularly to have an award in the name of John Martin Bartlow. It means so much to me. And I also just am grateful that you've chosen to elevate an otherwise often ignored story. So thank you. Okay, so this article. The article I wrote really follows an epic story of one Black family in North Carolina struggling to hold on to their ancestral land. And I focus on a family, the Reels family, who had bought this gorgeous piece of property on the coast of North Carolina more than 100 years ago. They were just one generation removed from slavery at the time, and they created this microeconomy on the shore, fishing and farming, and they passed it on generation after generation until they were suddenly dispossessed, and it was against their will and without their knowledge. I wanted to understand why, and so I'm looking in this story at a legal concept that's called Ayers Property. And Ayers Property describes land that's been passed on often through many generations without a will. What ends up happening is that the ownership is quite unstable. And it's very easy for speculators in particular to take that land through loopholes in the law. And I looked very specifically at 3 different legal mechanisms that are used to take heirs property. It sounds like a very niche subject, I know, and it's not. So 1/3 of Southern Black-owned land is estimated to be in heirs property. That's worth potentially over $28 billion by some estimations, right? So this is a lot of lost financial wealth, or the risk of losing so much of your finances. But I also wanted to look very specifically at the emotional toll of losing land. And the brothers who I focus on are named Melvin and LaCurtis, the Reels brothers, I call them, and everyone calls them that in town. And they were fascinating people to spend time with because the land meant so much to them, and they felt so tied to that piece of property and so strongly that it was morally theirs, even though it was legally no longer theirs, that they sacrificed their liberty instead of walking off that property. So when the court ordered them to leave, they said no, and they understood that that meant that they were being thrown in jail. And they spent 8 years in jail until they were released last winter. And even when they got out, they still had no legal recourse to regain that piece of land on the shore. That's the gist.
So when you talk about the Reel brothers and the emotional toll that is part of this story, I want to add that the John Bartlow Martin Award it's looking for social justice journalism, but it's also looking for the journalism that carries the tradition of really strong feature writing and evocative, descriptive, put you in the shoes of these people kinds of stories. And this certainly does this through the window into the Reels. But I was really curious about how a reporter from New York can go down and meet these 2 guys and their family who have every reason to distrust kind of the whole world, given what they've been through with their land. And how did you get them to trust you enough to tell a story with this kind of emotional depth?
It's always a question for me because I'm always looking for that kind of trust and intimacy. And I think that the greatest resource that I have is time. So when I go report, first of all, I spent a lot of time just sitting on people's couches. And I did that with the Reels family for a while, without a notebook, just listening to them for hours and hours and hours, and eating with them and walking with them and going in their cars when they had errands to run. And I think I often find, and I found in this case in particular, that I needed to show this family that I can work around their schedule. I can be there and let their schedule dictate when they can speak with me. And that I'm not just there to do a quick turn story, that I want to understand depth. And that, in this case, and in almost all of my experience as a journalist, has proved to be the most essential tool for me to establish trust. And I understand that it is not a tool that everybody has at their disposal. I've been extremely lucky to have it. I spent a little over 2 months in North Carolina for this story. The tricky thing was I first got in with the family, of course, but the brothers were in jail. And so then I had to establish a phone rapport with the brothers while they were in jail, which is it's just hard. You know, you have 15-minute slots and you can't see each other. And there were certainly moments in my reporting where they worried that I was not on their side, that I was potentially with the other side, is how they saw it. And I would have to kind of talk them back around to my role as a journalist.
15 minutes over the phone sounds a lot like the reporting all of us are doing right now. So I'm curious, what worked for you in that situation?
On the phone?
Yep.
It was really difficult. In fact, and especially because Melvin, who's one of the main characters of this story, he's so infuriated about the loss of his land that once you ask him, he'll just go. And his mind will spin and he will talk until he feels as if he has expressed what he needs to express about the injustice of the situation. And so what worked for me was getting on the phone with him and doing hours of those calls where I barely asked a question. Because I think in a sense that allowed him to believe that I was not writing him off, that I was listening. And I was. I mean, it was very fascinating to hear him describe how he experienced the land loss. To be honest, it was much easier once they were released from jail to actually conduct more in-depth conversations. And I think especially because they felt like they were being listened to on the phone as well. Once they had left the jail and that Melvin and I could find like a more private space to speak, often in his car, I found that he was most able to reflect on himself.
So I feel like I kind of got into the middle of the reporting process. I want to go back to the beginning because I know you've said that this story began by way of one statistic that you saw in a newspaper, that only 1% of the nation's farmers are African Americans, and you found that astonishing. But I was thinking about the fact that all of us read astonishing statistics in the newspaper every day, and the difference is how you decide to act, and how do you act on a stat like that, both to unravel it and then to find out what's behind it enough to then knit it together and find a beautiful story and narrative in it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly find stats that go nowhere. But with this stat, a friend of mine actually pointed me to the statistic and we were talking about it. And I generally turn to academic literature to try to understand the genesis of a problem, historians and legal scholars in this case. And a lot had been reported on the USDA and their discrimination against Black farmers and their role in dispossessing Black farmers across the South. And they played an enormous role in that. When I started to dig into the literature, though, I found this very small corner of scholarship that was looking specifically at Ayers Property, which is something I had never heard of. And it was described in they're fantastic scholars who are looking at it, but it was very difficult for me to find anything systematic that looked at it. And that's because Ayers Property cases are held in county courts, which all store their case files in different ways. And it's very difficult to actually, you would have to sit in a courthouse and go through the files manually. What I could see, though, was that North Carolina had the best system. So they were all going to at least be in a separate room, even if they were going to be in the courthouse, even if those case files were going to be mixed up with adoption cases and name changes. They would still all be in one room. And so there was an opportunity for me to dig a little bit. So that was one thing I saw, right? I saw an ability for me to do some accountability journalism and to look at the scope of the problem of dispossession of heirs property. But also in a lot of the academic literature, I saw really beautiful and powerful anecdotes of families that had been paying taxes on land that they had lived on all their lives, that felt extraordinarily tied to the land because it was such a part of their family history, and were losing it and didn't understand how that could possibly be legal. And it felt to me like it had this historical element. So I guess I should also say the history was also incredibly powerful to me, because during Jim Crow, first of all, you have the failures of Reconstruction, and then you have a moment in history where Black families actually were incredibly good at acquiring land that was promised to them but never given to them, and taking ownership of that land and cultivating that land for themselves. And then you see this pattern of dispossession. And there was very good reason during the Jim Crow era for Black families to be suspicious of white supremacist courts, right? So I felt like it had all of these elements. It had this history element that I could really dig into. It had this emotional element. And then there were these legal mechanisms that I was going to be able to report out.
But then you also found stats. What was the one that you hinted at earlier, for like in this county in North Carolina, 42% of the cases involve Black families, but only 6% of the county is Black. And it sounds to me like that was an actual document search. Like, so tell us a little bit. So I'd say that sounds like there's a fourth thing, was that there's a really incredible paper trail, even if it was something you had to did you really have to manually do it?
Yeah, I did. So it's fun. I as I was doing that work, that was probably 10 days of me with the help of very gracious clerks who really wanted to get rid of me at that county courthouse, pulling these archival folders from the basement. It was me going through every single partition case that I could find in Carteret County over the past decade. And as I was doing it, I kept saying to my friends that I'm doing 10 days of work for one sentence in a story. But in a lot of ways, it was one of the most important sentences in the story, because I was able to demonstrate through a decade's worth of research, or a decade's worth of paper, that this was a problem that disproportionately affected Black families in this county. And that was something that was had been very difficult to prove before, just given the amount of resources and time it takes to sit in the courtroom and do that kind of work.
And I'm amazed at the breadth of the kinds of work this story took, like academic research, emotional reporting and getting trust, and then 10 days of records research. Is like 3 different humans all in one in one reporter. One of the aspects of the story that really stood out to me in the reading of it, and it's something you and I had discussed briefly, is how many different versions of the story that you kind of had to track down. That as a reporter, there were several narratives, and I'm wondering how you handled that both as a reporter and a writer, and even maybe in the fact check and editing process. If there's so many versions of events, how did you figure out how to handle that?
So this is, I think this was part of the reason why I spent over 2 months on the ground there. So part of the, I think, challenge of writing about historical stories is that, first of all, people's memories change over time. And there are missing memories, and there are different memories, especially when you're talking about a story that affects really dozens of people in this case. And so what I realized pretty early on in reporting the story was that I could never rely on a single person for a fact about the family's history. And in fact, if I wanted to feel good about the story, I needed 3 people on every fact. And if you look at a story like this, there's usually a fact in almost every sentence, right? So it takes an enormous amount of time just to kind of cross-check what you are hearing. For anyone who hasn't read the story, partly that's because the family and some of the family is split on what happened when, and then you have the family's version of the story, which is different between different people, and then you have the legal system and the lawyer's version of the story. So I also had to be able to toggle between these legal accounts and the memories of the family members, and try to figure out how they laid on top of each other, and where there was tension between the two.
And how did you resolve that tension? Was it really just three sources on every fact, or is there an example of one where what the family said trumped maybe the paper record and vice versa?
It's a good question. Yeah. So the story, part of the story hinged on one meeting about land ownership in the 80s, I believe, or it might have been 79. And there are 3 surviving heirs from that meeting. 3. And there's one lawyer who was there. And so I had Melvin and his mom saying one thing about the meeting, but I almost felt as if they had told themselves so many stories about the land that even their language was resembling each other's when they weren't in the room. And I felt as if it had become like a memory that had been ossified into a story. And I wasn't sure if it was a memory anymore. And so I had to track down the other living heir and get his version. And he doesn't live on the property. He's much less involved in the property. And so it was incredibly important for me to hear his. And he actually, it turned out, had an even stronger memory than either of them did. And although he could corroborate some of what they said, he could also explain in much more detailed terms. Just little moments from that meeting that allowed me to feel like it had come alive.
So he didn't contradict them, but the fact that he had that kind of detail, so it was kind of like a lucky break in a way, right?
Yes, it's not right. He didn't contradict them. Maybe it was, there was some dispute over who was actually there and what they were wearing and what they dressed like, so there are little things like that, and you have to kind of find what feels right. Feels right to everyone who is there,
Keep going.
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So, but you built a lot of scenes that people helped you find. So you're talking about, if they disagree on the color of the jeans or the this, that, and the other, how do you manage that? And then how do you then explain, how do you get the fact checkers on your side when it comes down to the final production on the piece?
I think what I will always do is, if I get 3 accounts and some detail stands out in one, I go back to the other 2 people and say, hey, do you remember this? Do you think this is false? Do you think that it's probably true? Should I trust Charles's memory on this? I do it, I go all the way around again, in a sense, to make sure that things fit. I mean, the one detail that was really difficult in this piece for Melvin is that I explain as part of the piece that Melvin, who really becomes the gatekeeper of the property, I explained that when he realized the law wasn't on his side, he would sometimes take out a rifle if people came on the property. Mm-hmm. And many of his family members had told me that. That's not true. I'll start again. Many people who had visited the land, and these were actually white people, had said that about him. And it was written in court documents. And the family did not want to talk about it. And Melvin did not want to talk about it. And it took a lot of going back to them and explaining to them that this is what I had heard and that this is what I had read, for them to feel comfortable with some kind of admission that that was the case.
So I'm just going to keep pushing a little bit, because I think the idea of how we take something and know that it's true when we weren't there, or feel comfortable enough presenting it. If it was in a court document, why was that not proof enough? Why was it so important to you to get Melvin to say, yes, this is true?
So you have to look at what part of a court document something's in, right? So in this case, it was written as a part of a police report. And so it was a report of a speculator who was on the property. And so I understood that there was a possibility that that person had fabricated the story. It wasn't proven in the court of law. It was certainly admitted as evidence. So that didn't feel like enough of a fact, although I did have 2 people who said it separately, who were not part of the family. But I didn't want to print something before going to the family and giving them every opportunity to talk about it. And that was actually one of the hardest conversations for some reason. Not one, you rarely know what the hardest conversation is going to be when you write these stories, but that was for some reason one of the hardest ones. I think they were just scared of how they would be perceived, right? And it took a lot of time to talk through why this is just a part of the human experience, to feel like you need to defend yourself when the law can't defend you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a powerful scene in the story, actually. I would agree with that. I'm impressed that you essentially reported the story 3 times as you go through. I have a couple more questions before I open up to the audience. One, I wanted to ask more about you personally, and we have a lot of journalism students who are on the call right now with us, and a lot of soon-to-be working journalists. And I read your bio. You've done all this amazing reporting, but I also know from a little digging of my own that you didn't immediately launch into journalism. You did some world exploring, and I thought it would be really useful for students to hear what those first steps for you were after graduation, and how you think that has actually contributed to the kind of journalism you're getting to do today.
Yeah, I took a very strange route into journalism in some ways. I graduated college and took a fellowship teaching English in Northwestern Thailand. And I went to teach there at a time that was politically quite tense. And it turned out that I was living in the poorest part of the country that was also a very politically agitated part of the country. And that the people who my neighbors essentially, were becoming quite politically active and demanding more equitable distribution of rights, essentially. I had never done any journalism, but I felt so confused by the mainstream English language newspapers that I was reading they were coming out of Bangkok, and also confused why there weren't any reporters in the region that I was in who were writing for the national papers there, that a friend of mine and I decided, let's just give it a go. And we started trying to report out local politics stories about the people of this region we were in, the Isan region, who were mobilizing for a free and fair election, essentially, and how they were doing that. And we didn't know how to write, so we would take articles from newspapers and study their structures and then try to mimic it, and we would write these really dry newspaper articles. Anyway, I loved it. So I discovered something I loved. And then I came back to the States after a few years, and I worked for Nick Kristof for a bit as a researcher on a book he was doing, and I loved getting to watch him take an idea and turn it into, in this case, a chapter of a book from start to finish. And then I realized that if I wanted to do the kind of hard-hitting journalism that spoke most to me, I had a BA in classics, and I felt like I was not prepared. And so I went and got a master's degree in public policy because I was interested in social policy. And then from there, I was in England at the time, and I stayed in England, and I started freelancing for national papers there. And I kind of knew that I wanted to do magazine journalism. That's what I loved reading, and that's what really moved me most. And even in my own reporting for newspapers, I found that it was difficult for me to explore like the nuances of whatever system I was looking at, or the emotional experiences of the people I was talking to. And so I felt like if I could create a portfolio of good enough clips in newspapers, I'd be able to pitch my first magazine story. And so that's kind of how I worked my way into the field.
What was your first magazine story?
My first magazine story was about the exploitation of Filipino cruise workers on cruise ships. And as a freelancer, I was lucky. I applied for grants to get funding for these things. And an organization that's now called Type Investigates, but was previously called the Investigative Fund, funded me for all of my investigations while I was a freelancer. And so that gave me a huge lift in terms of giving me time and resources to do the kind of deep reporting that I wanted to do.
Yeah, they're really, in fact, we've had John Bartlow Martin Award winners from the type investigations as well. Before I turn it over to questions for the audience, so just audience, please start peppering any questions you have into the Q&A tab. If you could tell us a little bit about the impact that this story has had. I mean, lots of times we write about big societal problems and hope we get people's anger up, but you've actually, this story has been able to make some changes. So tell us a little bit about that while people populate the Q&A.
Yeah, so one of the things that was interesting about the story was that I published it at a time where there was already discussion within Congress about Ayers Property and what to do about it. And after the article came out, it was passed around, and Congress voted on and passed a $5 million bill, essentially, that would give legal organizations funding to help Ayers Property owners clear up their titles and consolidate their ownership. And that's kind of a starter fund to see how the program goes and to tweak it from there. So that was an enormous, that was a really wonderful thing to see, I have to say. I think it's very difficult to do this work and expect policy change. And it's extraordinarily satisfying to see that sometimes it does actually contribute to policy change. And then I think on top of that, I've been lucky to see how it's also affected the very few nonprofit organizations that are working on this issue, and they feel as if it's also kind of elevated their role in this space financially and just in terms of accessibility. People know to look for them now, and so that's also been wonderful to hear.
What do you would you want sort of the perfect solution to this to be? I think the complexity of the law and the taxes and everything that, as you read it, you wonder, like, can these folks really own their land outright? What do you see a clear path?
It's a really complex issue, and I don't think there's one clear path. I do think that our lawmakers have a responsibility to at least make it much easier for Ayers Property owners to, if not, consolidate their land, which is what they're trying to do right now, consolidate ownership and clear titles. But also to find alternatives, because sometimes that's an extraordinarily complex and costly process, and it doesn't sound like that's going to change anytime soon. And so one thing we haven't talked about is that Ayers Property owners often can't get FEMA grants, they can't get home repair grants, they can't even use their home as collateral for private financing, right? So there certainly ought to be solutions that can be put into legislation that would allow Ayers Property owners to find alternative documentation to say these are our heirs, we own this property, we want to use it as collateral for these grants.
I could keep asking questions, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience because I really want to keep going deeper. But I know we have a couple questions popping up, and I'm going to ask Stacy Simpson to jump in and ask the questions for us since she has a clearer view.
Just Nicole Girton just wanted to say she taught English in Thailand as well. She was in Chanthaburi, excuse my pronunciation, in 2017. Said it's very cool that you discovered your love of journalism while you were over there. And then next question, what efforts are underway to restore land titles to heirs rights holders? Do you think there is a political will to reform this?
So I do, this is kind of going back to what our final question here. It feels like in the past couple of years, there have been much more serious questions being asked at the national level about reparations and what reparations might look like in this country. And one of the things that a lot of experts have talked about is the need to think about maintaining and land ownership, in particular for African Americans, right? So I do believe that there at least was some political will. I think political will is a really hard thing to get right now, but I have been hopeful, given what we saw in Congress last year, that there's a move to figuring out ways in which Congress can help Ayers Property owners kind of clear up those titles and consolidate that ownership.
Excellent. Stacy, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. Dan Martin says, is there any possibility that the brothers in the story will be able to recover their property at some point? Are they still fighting for it in any legal way?
It's a really good question, and I think that was one of the greatest tragedies of this story. So Melvin and LaCurtis spent 8 years in jail because they didn't want to give up their property. And when they got out last winter at the ages of 72 and 61, they still had no legal recourse to regain their land. So the way their land was taken is through this very obscure law called the Torrens Act, and you only have 1 year to appeal it. And in North Carolina, it's different by states. You have 3 years if you can prove something fraudulent happened. And so they missed that mark by a year. And now the Torrens is effectively incontrovertible. So no, not through the courts. They have no way. I think that they do have some will, however, to try to raise money to buy it back from the developer who currently owns it. Whether or not they can do that remains unseen.
I'm going to jump in and ask a question from Professor Doug Foster, who says, first, thanks for being with us. And he wants to ask about the narrative, pointing out that there's this beautiful weave between the anecdotal strand and the family and the analytical strand, the history, etc. And we sort of talked about the fact that all these pieces were there, but he wanted to know how you struck the balance in the writing and the choices that you made about that. And I guess I would add to that, I'm curious about the choice to talk more about what Doug's talking about here in the narrative strain as well versus the solution strain that we've all been asking about now.
Wow, two hard questions.
Yeah.
I think yeah, it is such a good question about how you figure out how to weave in the anecdotes with the policy and with the explication. And it's something I'm constantly trying to find the balance of. In this case, I knew that the Reels family, that their story had enough twists and turns that they were going to be the spine. Mm-hmm. But I also was very aware that the mechanism by which they lost their land was pretty obscure. And so I really needed to have two different sections where I pulled out and described these other two mechanisms that are actually both more common. One is tax sales and the other is partition sales. And I started off structuring the story a little bit differently, where I kind of, it's too kind of detailed to explain here, but I tried to kind of slip one of those in up top because I thought I could just do it neatly. And then with my editor at the New Yorker, we realized that it was a little fraudulent. Like I really did need to have these sections that were like, and now I'm going to explain to you tax law, and now I'm going to explain to you partition law. And I didn't want them to sound like that. So I also needed to find families who could illustrate it, and cases that could illustrate it. So I went looking, and that's essentially how we ultimately landed on a structure that was so intertwined. But I do think it comes down to a question of craft and just knowing. I mean, I read all my stories out loud over and over and over again, because at a certain point you're like, wait, am I lost? Is this flowing? Am I bored? And I'm constantly trying to see how that weave is working. And I do think it takes a certain kind of eye to see if the balance is just right. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer there.
These are all good answers. I think Doug and I both teach people to think about the sections in the story, but you made it sound like you started writing and then went back and had to do more reporting. Is that, or?
No, I had the reporting, thank God. I just was trying to sneak in one legal mechanism up top without doing this breakout section, right? And I think that my editor and I agreed ultimately that it's actually more confusing sometimes. Like sometimes the things that are complex, you actually do just need to break them apart piece by piece, and allow them to each live on its own. And that I do actually think streamlined the story immensely, and hopefully gave readers a minute to sink into one idea and then come back to the spine of the story, which was the Reels family.
This is such a professor question, so I want a really big number to be the answer. How many drafts do you think you wrote?
I don't know. I mean, it was my first draft is actually quite different from the final draft of this article. And that's not always the case. So the major restructuring happened in the second draft.
Mhm.
And then from there, it is refine, 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 refine. And I would probably say it was that many times of refine, 5 or 6, essentially.
Do you know your lead before you start writing, or does it evolve, or does it change? Tell us a little bit about some of the, because that goes to some of the questions Professor Foster was raising too, about what narrative do you start with, and how do you introduce the exposition? When do you know to do that?
Yeah, I did know my lead. And I think one of the benefits of being on the ground for 2 months was that while I was there, I could draft out what each section would do and mess around with sections a bit. I typically don't like to leave a reporting trip until I know my first section and I have the scenes from that first section, and I know my ending and I have the scenes from that ending. And then I need to understand how the rest of it moves and where the key turning points are. But those are the 2 things I'm typically most careful not to leave a reporting trip without.
So tell me a little bit more about that process. You know, we all love the process. Does it happen where you're sitting there and you're talking to someone, and you're like, that's my lead, or that's my, that quote's going to frame my ending? Or are you going home at night and typing up all the notes and rearranging ideas and consciously trying to seek a lead in the midst of all that?
It can happen in different ways, but I think with this case, I was so enmeshed with the family that there were times when they went to church and I would sit in the car. I remember one day I went to church with them and I sat in the back and I just took a ton of notes for myself. I'm like, what if I try this? What if I try that? And it was in that moment at church where I started to see the top of the story and I understood what I needed for the bottom of the story. So sometimes it happens when I'm back at home transcribing, and sometimes when I'm extremely, sometimes you're just in the field and you're doing it all at once, And I think with this case, there was just so much talking. We were talking all the time that I just felt like I was so present with them. Like there wasn't even much time to reflect. I just had to be in it. And so it's almost unsurprising to me that I was uncovering the structure of my story while I was sitting in church with them.
I mean, you're sitting in church. So what is your preferred note-taking method? That's actually a question that comes up a lot for students about, learning to take notes on the fly is hard. So what methods work for you best, especially in the different kinds of reporting you had to do for this story?
It's really different. With them, I often just let my tape recorder go. Mm-hmm. And I would take little notes for myself about when they said something like particularly poignant, or just went through kind of any kind of chronological thing that I was going to have to come back to. But yeah, I had hours and hours and hours and hours of tape for this. It's different with different people. So that's sometimes what I like to do with families I'm reporting on, and particularly families who don't have much experience. I don't know. I like the feeling that I'm not taking notes. And sometimes if I'm with a family or people who I feel like they think I'm their friend and I'm not a journalist, I'll take out a notebook to show them that I am, and so that they're reminded of that. I think it's also I take a different tack if I'm talking to different people. So sometimes I'm talking to, well, I don't know. I actually did the same thing with a lawyer in this case, to be honest. When I would sit with him, I would keep a recorder often, or take tiny little notes.
We do have another question I'm seeing in the Q&A chat now. Dan Martin was wondering, what was the attitude of the white people you encountered in doing the legwork on this story in North Carolina?
On doing the legwork?
Mm-hmm. And reporting.
Tough. It was really tough. And I think there were a lot of white people who felt like the family had made this a story about racism, and they wanted to tell me that they weren't racists. And they also, in the same breath, wanted to blame the Reals family for their loss of the land on personal responsibility. They should have known better to make a will. And I think one of the benefits of going to kind of the opposing voice of a story early and often is you hear the way that they justify what they've done and where they see the problems are, and you learn to write to them as well. And so for me, one of the main objectives of the story was in kind of dismantling that assumption of personal responsibility, was saying, like, how can I use history, and this family's history in particular, and then the broader history of this country and the South, to explain why it makes perfect sense that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of families might not have made wills, and why they're still not making wills today, because it's so difficult to clear up this ownership.
Right. It's a really powerful part of the story. But I'm curious the way you said that reporting on the opposition gave you the ability to see that. So was that something that you really focused on once you were out reporting, or is that something that was coming up in some of those original literature searches and that sort of thing? I'm curious how that, unpacking a little bit that what the opposition tells you, and you said getting it early is important. So go into that a little bit more.
I certainly had seen mention of the view that this was a problem of personal responsibility, but I think it is quite shocking when you're talking to real estate lawyers, for example, who will make the same claim. And they know better than anyone how difficult it is to clear up titles and to consolidate ownership. And so to hear people in positions of power who know the law so well make those kinds of remarks is quite startling. And I think for me, it made me think that I had a lot of work to do in making sure that the writing was airtight so that that side, that voice would be addressed.
Another question we have is that how much, after you publish a big story like this, and you've done other big award-winning stories on totally different topics, so how much do you continue to follow the story once you've published something big or even won an award or created some change? Do you have to just move on to the next one, or how can you balance this sort of series of important policy pieces that are becoming your track record?
So I guess, so professionally, eventually I have to move on to the next one. I think personally, I guess another point is, though, at ProPublica, it's kind of a rare breed in that we believe in following the story and seeing what kind of change comes out of it, and reaching out to Congress people and saying, what are you going to do about this? And if you act, I want to cover it. So there is certainly interest from my editors in kind of chasing impact in some way. And that's an enormous privilege that I know many journalists don't have. Personally, there are some people who I've written about who have ultimately become friends, and I check in with them, and I'm very lucky to call them friends from all around the country. And the Reals family, I do talk to them a fair amount. I actually we started to make a documentary about them while I was down there. And so there's still a lot of conversation with them about that work. But I also just call and check in on them.
So I'd love to know, is the documentary actually going to happen? But one of my other questions was, how did the Real family receive the story?
They loved it. I think, so for me, often when people ask me, like, what is the main thing you want out of a story? I want the people who I'm writing about to feel like it is not only fair and accurate, but vivid. And I was, in this case, lucky enough that they really did feel that way. They felt very excited to be able to see their lives on the page and to feel their lives on the page. I think one of the things that was hard for me in the story is that the story ends with this kind of fantasy that they're going to get their land back. And there are some members of the family who don't want to call it a fantasy, right? They still are living in that fantasy. And so I was quite concerned that was going to be hard for them to read. And I don't know to what extent it was.
So you mentioned the scene, we talked a lot about that scene with the guns, but do you have a favorite scene in the story that reminds you of like a moment as the reporter when you knew you had the story, or what would you pull out of the story?
That's a good question. It's interesting when you were talking about your lead and when you know you have it. There was this one moment where I was finishing up my 10 days of going through record searches. And so I would spend every day in the courthouse. And to get into the courthouse, I would have to put my bag through a security thing. And there were 2 security guards who stood at the front of the courthouse. And one day as I was leaving in the late afternoon, one of the bailiffs looked at me and was like, "Whatever happened to their uncle?" And I was like, "Oh, you know the story?" Like everyone knew there that I had worked on it. And she was like, "Oh yeah, I know it. I was the one who put them in jail, and I had never booked anyone from civil superior court. And so I only had one set of handcuffs because I didn't expect to arrest anyone. And I put one cuff on one brother and the other cuff on the other brother." And there was just so much in that one detail where I felt like I could nail that scene. And just her own surprise at arresting these brothers on that day and how ill prepared she was and how she had to lock them together. It was both like so literally beautiful and then metaphorically powerful.
Yeah, actually, that's definitely one of those details that really stands out. As we're getting ready to wrap up, let's see, Stacy, jump in if you see any more questions. Otherwise, I'll ask the classic, what advice would you have for folks who are graduating right now, uncertain times, uncertain job markets? What would you tell them about going into journalism?
It's a hard time to go into journalism, but it's always a hard time to go into journalism. At least it has been for the past 15 years or so. I think a couple of things. I think my path is different from some, but for me, I think a few things helped me. One was finding stories that I loved and that I was so attached to and had so much conviction about that I didn't want to let go of. Because I think the beginning can be a little disheartening. So I would cold pitch tons of editors and I'd sometimes follow up 3-5 times to get an assignment if I could, right? And so I think it was really important to me to have stories that I believed in so strongly that I could push for them and advocate for them and get them in a paper. So that's definitely, I think, one of the main pieces of advice I have is to really find a story that grips you, and to then go for it and give it everything.
Excellent. I love that advice. And I want to end with a comment from Cynthia Coleman, who is Cindy Martin Coleman, who is John Bartlow Martin's daughter, who's also on the call tonight. And she said, "Hi, I'm John Bartlow Martin's eldest child. Congratulations on winning the award. I think the dad would have been very pleased." I think that's a lovely way to end this. So thank you very much. And I know Stacy has a few announcements, but we really appreciate you spending the time with us, and congratulations again on such a fantastic story.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so appreciative.